Okay, before we get started, I have a great. Um, Jackson, are you okay?
Yeah, I was just
I
I need you to move.
it's fine. I just want to make an important note. Please do not put any paper in the toilet. Um, um, okay. Okay. All right. Before we get started, this project has taken on a lot of time and made my room look like that a lot of the time, a lot of the
You
days.
look Steven.
That's who I blame is this project for my room look like that. But
Where's your bed?
it's over there, but
Oh, okay.
it's usually covered in paper in my room, and sometimes also lead to like coffee shops. I take over 2 tables, just doing nothing, and then also turned into a weird situation of where my ibu does the laundry on the other side, and I'm like sitting on the other laundry table with the iron facing that way and just juggling down notes fiercely as my ibu keeps spraying some chemicals into the air. So anyways, that's my ISP. I've read too much, a whole stack of all that in the past 3 weeks. It's some not that good, some some are alright. So anyways, I wanted to start with a single event on the May that took place in May 1998 on the street of Jakarta. Does anyone know what that event is? Anyone?
I'm guessing someone got shot.
Someone did get shot.
Yeah.
Actually, more than someone.
Riots lead to street violence of some sort.
Yeah, so in 1998, it was last year Suharto was still in power, and that year there's starting to be riots, and started off as protests on the streets, but it soon turned into a riot. Here are some images of the post 1998. This is one of the downtown area of Jakarta. This is another picture of what, this is kind of a forgotten part of the history that is often not being talked about. Versus people talk a lot about the 1966 massive genocide, but few mentions this riot, which actually by scale size is fairly large. And also it's targeted mostly against one single ethnic group, as we can see here. This is people waving the drawing of one of the biggest tycoons in Indonesia. We'll talk about his story very soon, about how he became this symbol and figure of unequally distributed wealth and income inequality. But so what caused this whole riot? So in 1997, there was the famous Asian financial crisis, where you can see that this is I believe, stock exchange, and in Asia, red represents the stock is going up, and the green represents the stock is going down. So there you have it. You can see how many stocks are going up and how many are going down, or the only one that's going up. I don't know which one that is that's going up. So leading towards this huge street protest is a huge inflation of daily commodities in Indonesia. In 1997, there is up as 80% of inflation as to daily commodities like rice, like cooking oils, like gasolines. These basic daily needs was going up partially because of financial crisis, and that's also when the rupiah dropped from at the beginning of the financial crisis, rupiah was 2,400 to a dollar. To at one point it was 17,000 to a dollar. So that's part of what spiked a lot of the street protests, was that that daily living conditions were becoming challenging, which people had every right to do, to go on the street and protest the government. But at the same time, all the politicians were kind of afraid of taking the blame that, oh, it is because our party had a fault in this, that the rupiah dropped so much that you lost money, that the daily commodities is going up. So they had what you would say a scapegoat, someone to take the blame. And who that is, that turns to be the Chinese Indonesian communities, whom they spread a lot of politicians were, especially those who aren't elected, were spreading an opinion, or rather they claim a fact, is that they claim that 3%, which is at the time the representation of Chinese Indonesian populations, owns over 70% of the total GDP per capita, total GDP of Indonesia, which many scholars has debated over whether that's factually true or not. Until this day, I could not find a single document that proves exactly that statistic is correct. But politicians use this number over and over and over and over, both during the 1997, during when the Asian financial crisis hit, and also before that. But one single political slogan is not enough to incite a riot. To the extent in which here is some of the victim testimony of some the victims of the 1998 riot. Will anyone feel comfortable read the first paragraph for us? This is from a rape victim who was quoted in study. She chose to remain anonymous.
I can read it. I was scared to death and couldn't drive the car because in front of the max, it blocked it with wood and metal. Feeling really afraid, I then got out and asked them for mercy. While I was still conscious, several big men pulled me by the legs, and one after the other they raped me. I still have lots ahead of me. As a girl of 26, I still have lots of chances to find a better life, but not in this land where I was born.
So this is from an Indonesian-born Chinese ethnic Chinese minority who was living in Jakarta at the time. And later we have some other quotations. The second is from a stockbroker who said, where would I go? I can go to, where would I flee this violence, this riot? I could go to Singapore, but it's expensive. I mean, I will stay, but I am scared. And the last quote is from a store owner who said, the big people, meaning the people who went on street for riots and strike, will come back and pick up their pieces. We're small. We have to start it all over again. So you can tell that this is a community. A community was deeply hurt in this event, and all of these people are ordinary Indonesian citizens. Apart from anything else, they hold an Indonesia passport, and they are the citizen of the Indonesian Republic, and there is nothing that is ethnic, that is nationally representing them as Chinese, but yet somehow this ethnic group was specifically targeted during the 1997 riot in Jakarta by another group of very calm and very gentle Sudanese and Javanese population, whom we have had the pleasure and honor of staying for the past months, and we have known them to be very calm and very gentle people. So what is it that resulted in one very calming ethnicity group discriminates against another? Some estimates that those who are able to run away during this riot period took in total about $80 billion away with them as they fled Indonesia to nearby Singapore, Malaysia, which ironically it is about it's about 2 years worth of GDP at the time for Indonesia. So what Indonesia needed much to recover from the financial crisis was brought out of the country because of the riot. Um, but so here are some data presented by the Joint Fact Finding Team, which was assembled by the President of BB after the incident, and also by some volunteers. There are in total about 1,109 who died in the fires, 27 shot dead, 91 wounded. And this is by all means the lowest estimate that the government is willing to admit. And 158 victims of rape who is willing to come forward at this moment. That there is still in the official report that the government still do not recognize them as victims of rape because both they argue there is no evidence, there's no basis for these accusations, and the district of Chinatown was completely destroyed with over 4,000 shops and properties burned, and along with 40 shopping centers. So the damage alone was worth 50 million US dollars, so that shows the significance of this not so much mentioned riot, which, remember, this is 1,109 people who had nothing to do with what was causing people to go on the street in the first place. So why did these people end up losing their lives? Some burned alive, some women still till this day unable to be recognized as a victim of rape, still staying silent. Why is that? Why is that? That this small percentage of population is somehow targeted at this moment as a scapegoat. And what is it that turned violence against them? So that's what I'm about to present to you about the stories of Chinese Indonesians, which I think is a century of confusion, connections, and conspiracies. Just a note ahead that I did not know any of these before I came to Georgia. I only started to read and learn more about events and the community after I arrived in Georgia. So some of them aren't necessarily as academic as it can be, but statistically speaking, that this is an important issue regardless of whether you care or not, because this day that Chinese descent Indonesians still controls much of this country's capita. That today half of all the billionaires, not in rupiah, in dollars, which billionaires in rupiah is not a lot of money. I'm sure we're all billionaires if we pull up our bank account in rupiah. But billionaires in dollars, half of them are Chinese descent. And out of the 10 richest men or women in Indonesia, 8 of them are ethnic Chinese. So that just represents in this vast and beautiful, diverse nation that how much financial capability the ethnic Chinese group holds. And we'll talk more about why that is. And in some ways that it is actually not by choice that they end up to be this way. But, and also, Chinese people represent, ethnic Chinese Indonesians represents about 1.2% of the total population today, which in the size of Indonesia, the fourth most populous country in the world, is about 3.8 million. So it is the lives about these 3.8 million people who has a very special sense of identity, special sense of community, and a sense of belonging. In an island where there are, as we can see on the map, over 300 different ethnicity groups. So Indonesia is very diverse. So I was fascinated to ask myself this question, that why is it in this diverse nation that this particular ethnicity group is always being discriminated against? And what it is that in a country where, for example, a country that really embraced tolerance and diversity. For example, the national language, Bahasa, is not the language spoken by the majority of the population, which is Javanese. Yet the government still chose Bahasa as a national language. That just symbolized that a sense, a willingness for unity. But why is it that the Chinese Indonesians aren't included in this part of unity? So let's back up for another moment. The year is 1966. This is the dawn of the Cold War, where the Soviet Union and the United States are competing for power around the world. During that time, it's very weird when you're entering Indonesia. At the airport, through custom, there is a very strange list of items that you cannot bring into country. Pornography, arms, narcotics, and any written language or text in Chinese. That's the 4 items at the moment that you're not allowed to bring to this country. And that was the case from 1966 until 1996. So for 30 years, that the country undergo what some would say, using the Bahasa term called pembaruan, which means assimilation or integration. The president, Suharto, implanted a combination of both language and traditions, banning a lot of activities to fast forward this so-called assimilation of Chinese, ethnic Chinese, into the Indonesian majority. In terms of the language, Chinese descent Indonesians were asked to change their names, that they're not allowed to have any names that are associated with Chinese language. They actually have Indonesian names. There is no Chinese text. All the Chinese newspapers were shut down. All the schools, which at the time, there are over 629 schools that was closed in the 1966 when the Pembaruan was going into effect. It dismantled all Chinese newspapers, and over 272,000 students were forced to just abandon their original school and be going to public schools. That's just the scale of that ban, and it also banned any of the Chinese activities in the city, which strangely that it even went into the. I know a lot of you went to karaoke yesterday. That it was banned that karaoke cannot have any Chinese songs, not a single one. All of them has to be deleted. So, and there is no official celebration of the Lunar New Year. All the temples had to either be closed or in the case of Georgia, they put a giant statue of Buddha in front of it to claim it is a Buddhist temple, therefore it's protected. So that just, it's a very strange policy, as one scholar notes, that contemporary Indonesia offers a rare example of officially banning a major world language. That this is a very interesting and very strange step that Suharto took to assimilate one group of one ethnicity group, particularly the Chinese Indonesians, into the supposed Indonesian majority. So that was the policy from 1966 until 1999. And another scholar noted that nowhere overseas has there been more Chinese killed or wounded, run away or being chased away, as so insecure during the past 20 years and so in Indonesia. So you can imagine a certain ethnicity group not allowed to speak its own language, not allowed to educate its children in its own dialogue. And remember, they're still learning Bahasa regardless of which school they ended up going to, but they weren't allowed to even celebrate their own traditional holiday. It's as if Christmas is banned, and you're no longer allowed to read any newspaper of your choosing, and you're only allowed to read Bahasa language, Bahasa newspaper. You can't even exercise. Even there was reports of people being slapped on the spot in public for speaking Chinese. So that's what it was like for this very small but still very decent size of ethnic group um, in Indonesia for about 30 years prior to the riot of 1997. So you can see that ethnic tension is already building up. Even though the government claim they have taken measures such as banning the language, banning this, using the ban as a way to integrate. But the tension continued to build up because there is just no example where it's been successful to integrate one group into the so-called common society by telling them strictly what to do and what not to do. And that is after the mass killing of 1965 and 66, which many of you have seen the film of the act of killing, and which till this day is not very publicly recognized. And during the massacre, a lot of the so-called communist communities the Chinese are also labeled, regardless of their party of choosing, were also labeled as a communist because it is commonly perceived that the PRC, the People's Republic of China, was behind that so-called attempted coup. So lots of ethnic Chinese people were killed and went to prison for just because of their because not even their nationality, because of their ethnic group. So that's another build-up point. But let's back up for a second for the full history of how ethnic Chinese communities arrived in this island. So the best way that from all of my research is that the best way to put it is that no one really knows for certain that how long the Chinese communities have existed in Southeast Asia. The time should be measured in centuries rather than decades. Long before discovery of America, there were settlements in Malaysia, in Java, and to an even greater extent of Thailand, Burma, and Indochina. This is by the executive director of Council on Foreign Relations, very forward-thinking. It's a huge think tank based out of Washington, D.C. And so that just explains that since centuries ago, that Chinese people have been coming to the island of Java and this archipelago to trade, to escape certain dynasties, to escape wars, to escape famine. So that they have been here for centuries. Right before, and then comes the Dutch colonization, in which before the Dutch even arrived and colonized Indonesia, a lot of Chinese community has already settled into this beautiful island, and many of them, some chose to become farmers, some chose to become traders, and those who become traders have developed a very massive network of resources and contacts throughout the island. So when the Dutch arrived, it seemed natural for the Dutch to split this country into 3 different levels, with the Dutch on the top, the Chinese merchants in the middle, acting as the middlemen and also as traders, and then the natives at the bottom. So you can see that from the Dutch colonization that Chinese are being labeled differently, partly because of their ability to trade and their already established vast network of connections. But at the same time, it's also a moment when the Chinese felt like where they belong, because they felt like, well, we have been here for longer than you colonists have been, but why are we being labeled as not native and being labeled as this weird middle class? We're not merchants or traders who are just here for the money. We have families here, we live here, and we are part of a community. So you can see that even before independence, that there is already a strong segregation, not imposed by the community, but rather systematic segregation between the Chinese and the rest. And that is for the purpose of the Dutch colonial government to best benefit from the trade, because they don't have all the network needed to connect this country of thousands of islands versus the Chinese, who have been doing some trading, has. And then comes the independent. Then comes the moment of independence. But after 100 years of colonization, where that the natives were asked to do farm work, to work at spice farms, to work at rice paddies, and Chinese were told to basically run business, become traders. So after independence, that was natural that most of the stores and convenience stores, most of the traders were ethnic Chinese, because that was what they were allowed to do. That's what they were asked to do. That's what they were forced to do to make a living. So right after the independence, that there was a question of where do you belong, because there was a moment that in Indonesia history where there was a huge debate for this problem of Chinese Indonesians, which was created by the Dutch colonial government. But now it's become a problem that's passed on to the independent Republic of Indonesia. There is politically speaking, there's the choice of left versus right in the very early years of Indonesia, where the left-inclined group wanted to propose to integrate integrations through allowing the retention of Chinese cultures and allowing the language to continue to flow, versus the right-wing group advocated for what ended up happening in 1966, a strong assimilation into the group by forcing the language, forcing the culture. At the same time, which China are you choosing? Right post-independence, there was a strong divide in the Indonesian community over the mainland China and Taiwan, which at the time is not the same China. There is pro-Taipei and pro-Beijing. And that is a huge debate over a lot of Chinese Indonesians to even decide, who they want to recognize as their legit government. And then there's also the question of citizenship, because for the first time, native Indonesians were on the topic of citizenship, because now they're an independent sovereign nation. But because of the Dutch colonial time again, that the Chinese felt like an outsider. So Indonesia and Beijing actually went under extensive debate and argument, and it turned out to be a choice of citizenship, that over a period of 2 years, Chinese Indonesians were asked to choose which country they want to live in, even though they had no idea of the country they might return to, or the country that they chose to stay, whether at the time they were treated as foreigners. So they were unknown. Most of them end up choosing to become a part of the Republic of Indonesia and become citizens of Indonesia. But despite a majority of them choosing to become citizens of Indonesia, their applicants for anything is still processed separately, because they are still labeled as outsiders, non-citizens, regardless of how this questionnaires was filled out. It's almost as if someone made a questionnaire to ask for your opinion, and then they went ahead with their plan anyways. That's what it felt like to a lot of communities, that merchants and traders who chose to become Indonesians, who end up obtaining an Indonesian passport, was still labeled as foreign workers inside this country. So during 1955, before Suharto and the mass killing happened, there was the central government started to realize the problem that a lot of Indonesians are asking is, why are all of the corner stores ran by ethnic Chinese? Even though they speak perfect Bahasa, the only difference is they look different. But they start to ask that question. And Sukarno at the time imposed a very interesting regulation in which he restricted Chinese rural retailers. He basically imposed that Chinese merchants were not allowed to do business outside certain cities. So all of the rural merchants end up leaving the countryside, basically giving up the business they have been building for centuries and sometimes for families of generations just because of this law, and end up settling into the main city. So that's the first direct policy act towards the Chinese Indonesians. And then comes the mass killing of 1955 and Suharto coming to power. And then as Suharto coming to power, he's imposed that strict regulation over Chinese language, Chinese culture, a strict ban over Chinese language, which is supposed to smooth this attention that was in the air after the 1955 coup and the mass killing. Supposedly, he hoped to integrate the community, when in fact, this angered the Chinese community. At the same time, the locals were not ready for the complete integration of two very different cultures. That's not by purposely just because how they developed, but rather because of centuries of colonization has separated different ethnicity groups into certain ways. And on one hand, that Suharto promoted a lot about integration into of Chinese people into the natives, the public. But at the same time, the political leader constantly distinguished Chinese from the majority. It's almost as if the community is being asked to integrate. But whenever there is an issue arise, when it comes to economic or just talking about Chinese, they're being labeled as a separate group, not in the retrospect of the whole community of Indonesia, but rather they're brought out and almost singled out as a separate community. So it's a very weird policy where on one hand there's strong assimilation and integration, but at the same time the government constantly mentions that the Chinese are different from the rest of the natives. And for example, like marriage certificates are processed separately based on ethnicity. So that was just a very confusing time and created even more ethnic tensions. As both the ethnic Chinese felt they're isolated, they're not being included in society, and at the same time the natives felt like after the genocide, after the communist coup, after their political leader constantly talking about the Chinese being taking over the country's economy, which in fact it is partially true, but not because by choice, but again because systematic segregation that have only allowed Chinese to work as merchants and traders. So remember this image we saw earlier that rised up that was a part of the 1998 riot. Let's talk a little bit about this stereotype of Chinese businessmen being successful and being just somehow wealthier than others. Let's talk a little bit about the story of this man, which he's very handsome, I have to say, even though he's bald, but it's a very beautiful portrait. You have to give him that. At 1996, I would do anything to get a portrait in 1996 to look like that. Except he's a little bit bald, which that is, I don't know. It's. Anyways, his name is Liam Seo Leong, which you can tell it is a part of the 1966 integration. He changed his name to sound more supposedly Indonesian. And the rise of a tycoon, as you would say. So this is in 1997 at the height of that riot. He's the founder of this group, has a total of $20 billion in terms of assets, and includes over some 500 companies and employs over 200,000 Indonesians. So by all scale, he is one of the biggest tycoons at the time, and he is often he is exactly your stereotype Chinese Indonesians who are good businessmen who have a lot of money, a lot of wealth, and a lot of influence. But how did he get that much money? Do not just get $20 billion handed to you. So let's talk a little bit about his story. So Liam came to Central Java. Liam's family came to Central Java in 1938. Fleeing back then was China, deep in the warlords of all sorts, fighting control over one area from another. He came from an area known as Fujian, which is a coastal province. And at the time there was a famine, and his family fled the country basically with nothing, come to Java in search of kind of a better life, as you would say. His family came at the age of 20, which when they arrived, they're one of the penniless immigrants, and work initially with their family in the rural part side as a small trader. They started out in the form of buy now and pay later store, which at the time was very popular among the rural side because a lot of people do not have money until when it's harvesting season. So their family opened up a little convenience store where they allowed locals to come in and buy stuff and just write down their names and pay back later. So that's how their family started. They also know because of this great economy model they had, which basically which people are buying stuff based on their goodwill. So they established a lot of connections on the countryside they were in. By no lucky strike or anything, but by hard work and taking a lot of risk. It takes a lot for a group of immigrants to open up a store and trust the locals and just hand out goods and trust that they will pay back. And it says a lot about how their family started. It says a lot about their traditions, about who they are. They're not the stereotype of only cared about money. They started off as a businessman who would hand out food and soap to people who do not have money and who are willing to trust them. So that's how they started, and eventually, and during the time, there was a day that the local independence committee, this was during independence, that during the fight between the Dutch and the locals, that the local communities was asked to host a political refugee who was fleeing, who was running away from the prosecution of the Dutch. And it's a mysterious visitor from Jakarta to this tiny village their family was in. And Liam's family said, sure, we'll take him in, knowing that this is a great risk. He took in this mysterious visitor, which turned out to be President Sukarno's father-in-law at the time. So through that, he gave refuge to back then not yet President Sukarno, but the first president of Indonesia's father-in-law, a refuge during a time when he was possibly being jailed and possibly being tortured. So he through that he made contact with various government officials, military officials, but in no ways was he ever given a right to anything. He just saw, because of his own generosity taking a political refuge, he was given the opportunities to connect with this later who would become the entire political society of Indonesia. So that's how he started off. So he started become a part of the independence movement, used a lot of his money and assets to support the military, the government. So he kind of was behind the independence movement. And then when Sukarno when Indonesia gained its full independence, he certainly had connections in the government, but none of them were super beneficial just yet. His lucky strike would be his closeness to Suharto, who was the dictator that imposed the dictatorship for over 30 years, and who was the same person who imposed the strict ban on Chinese language and Chinese culture. He during the early presidency of Sukarno, he became very close with Suharto's brother. So he kind of had a connection with the president before he came into power. And then came the 1955 and 1965 mass killing, and then Suharto came into power. And because of their closeness, Suharto kind of chose him as their become the sole producer and sole merchants who are allowed to import clothes, who are allowed to manufacture flowers, and so he kind of built his business empire through a combination of hard work, lucky strike, connections, and then at the same time a lot of business skills. But he's someone who, during the period of 30 years of anti-Chinese movement, he was very close to Suharto, back then the president, and whenever the public criticized Suharto for being so close to ethnic Chinese, Suharto just dismissed the argument, and because his economic interest was aligned with him. So that's about Liam. That's about a lot. He is just the most successful example of Chinese businessmen during the 1960s. But there are countless others who were kind of basically buying protection from the government, who was at the time very anti-Chinese from the outside. But when in fact inside the government, a lot of government officials are handing out contracts to Chinese businessmen, Chinese merchants, who are also secretly paying a bribe back to the government officials. So it created this very unhealthy relationship, where that publicly ethnic Chinese are being denounced, are not being allowed, but privately, because they are just like Liam's family, know so much connections around the island, because they have families, generations after generations of people doing business. They have a very good connection, and they are the easy group to do business with, and they're also the group that's easy to manipulate and control. So that created a weird situation in the 1960s, where that on one side the public thought that the government was anti-Chinese, wanting the Chinese to integrate, but at the same time doing business with a lot of Chinese businessmen under the table. And a lot of Chinese business also under the table paid bribe to a dictatorship to get security, because they were also afraid, because they see on the news that they are seen as this threat to the society, but at the same time the government are handing out contracts to them, and they're making money out of it. So they were a very vulnerable group who were not allowed to speak out, because their language, the newspaper, everything is banned. So the only thing they could do was to try to survive, which is the first thing they need to do. And so for 30 years, that's how this community kind of built up some of their wealth through secret contracts. And at the same time, distant away from the public, because they're both afraid and unable to speak up. Both because of the language ban, and also the politicians often have to distinguish themselves as to be not Chinese, to claim that I'm the natives, I'm all for you, when in fact they're secretly getting money from the Chinese merchants. But every now and then they have to publicly denounce the Chinese being not a part of the public, just so they can build a better public image. So in a way that so the Chinese are being manipulated in this part as a part of the political, both for political and also for economic gains. um, and they were without a voice. And at the same time, the literature of Indonesia also does not portray any image of Chinese Indonesian group, which by no means they're required or asked to do. But there's one study that found that between 1960 until the early 2000s, there was just not a single book written in Bahasa talking about the lives of this particular ethnicity group. And whenever that did happen, one time in a TV show, it was portrayed exactly to a stereotype of only caring about money. So that in that sense, ordinary Indonesians were only be able to get information from newspapers and politicians who are denouncing the Chinese, who are portraying them as this greedy businessmen. And the Chinese were not allowed a voice to speak up because they weren't allowed to even form political party, no language, again, no school, no nothing. So that's what led to the 1998 riot of this deep divide between the ethnic Chinese community and the rest, when in fact they're all together in this very corrupt dictatorship. It's just they're different pawns. And then come today, in which that there are now more after the fall of Suharto in 1998, following the riot, the BB reopened up, and it was Chinese language was once again allowed, and language school was slowly getting reopened. Confucianism is recognized as official religion. Lunar New Year is now one of the national holidays of Indonesia, and which is ironic, but it finally is. In 2006, the parliament passed the Citizen Law of Number 12, which is ironic and strange to say that after Indonesia obtained partial independence from 1945, it is not until 2006 that the parliament passed a law that recognized all native-born are Indonesian citizens, particularly mentioning the ethnic Chinese are being, for the first time, officially recognized as Indonesian citizens. It took over 60 years for this one single ethnicity group who had no other place. They're not recognized as a citizen of China. They're not recognized as a citizen anywhere to be officially recognized as a part of Indonesia. In 2016 national elections, there are 14 ethnic Chinese are elected as a member of parliament for the first time, kind of entering into the politics. And I think it's important we talk a tiny bit about Confucian concepts. This again is written on a research paper by the Council on Foreign Relations, the think tank in Washington, D.C., talking just a little bit about recognizing a little bit about what they are a little bit different than what a traditional. I think this is a good summary to summarize that. It is important to recognize there are a tiny bit difference for people who believe in more of a Confucian concept as life versus people who are Muslim or Christian. If anyone's willing to read this, thank you.
Their lives are molded by Confucian concepts. They are taught to be respectful to their parents, to defer to their elders, to love their brothers and sisters, and to be kind and truthful to their neighbors. They are more concerned with their relations with man than with God. They are more concerned with their present life than with the hereafter. The ethical instructions which they have received at home and in school are practiced in their daily lives. If they violate these ethical principles, they lose face with their fellow countrymen, probably, in their opinion, the greatest misfortune that could happen to them.
Yeah. So I think this is not the best way to summarize a very deep concept that has developed over 5,000 years and involves billions of people. But I think this is a small peak and a great analyze of just recognizing a little bit of that there are kind of different concepts in terms of what they value most in their lives. And I think it's enough talk. Let's see some charts and data and graphs. So in the 2016 trends in East Asia, the Indonesia National Survey Project of Economy, Society, and Politics, employed by one of the top Asia think tank. There is this survey, by the way, is I have the full survey here. It's very interesting to read. It's done actually in person, properly through interview of just vast representations by this very advanced think tank who used a lot of statistical analysis strategies to best represent all 36 regions of Indonesia and trying to interview all different types, all people from all walks of life. But there's one question about stereotype of Chinese Indonesians. Influence. The first one reads, Chinese Indonesians have too much influence in Indonesian politics. The medium grays agree, the light grays neither, the dark grays disagree. So you can see, this is in 2017, till this day, vast majority of people still believe that Chinese Indonesians have too much influence in political. And then there's a question that asks that Chinese have too much influence in economy. And look at the answer. It's over 60% of respondents said yes. They feel that there is too much influence by the Chinese Indonesians. Here's another chart of stereotype as privilege. Almost every single statement, life is easier for Chinese Indonesians. Chinese Indonesians are more likely to be wealthy than Perbina, which means the public. Chinese Indonesians are usually at least middle class. Chinese Indonesia has a natural talent for success in making money. Chinese Indonesians have opportunities in life than the indigenous. Once again, overwhelmingly, almost always more than half of the population agreed with these statements, which we know that for a fact that reading the story of Liam, that is not true. That it is not true that they're born with wealth. They're born with just this natural talent. They develop it through a lot of hard work, through kindness, and through taking risks. And again, this is whether you're comfortable with Chinese Indonesians as political leaders. And as you can tell, almost all ethnic groups responded with uncomfortable, except with the exception of Balinese, which has, I think there's a lot of argument to be made about whether that is the case, but partially some would argue their access to a lot of international travelers kind of have changed a little bit of their perception. So that's the charts. So let's just quickly do a time table. So 15th century is when presumably a lot of Chinese descent arrived. 17th century is when during Dutch colonization that Chinese are kind of steered towards become traders and merchandise. They're not the normal, but they're also not the favorite. But they're not the normal. So that's when slowly starts to feel that they're not a part of them. And then there comes the post-independence struggles, choices of which country you want. Do you want to go back to China, or do you want to stay in Indonesia? Who you are, who do you want to be? Talking about, between 1945 and 1966, that's when Chinese aren't allowed to do business outside major cities. You're being pushed back into this, to concentrate communities back again into the major cities, only allowed as merchants. That's when there was a general agreement that because Chinese is still viewed as non-citizens, they're only allowed to become like foreign investors in this country that even though they're born into, they're fluent in Bahasa, they probably know more about Indonesia than they know about China at all. But because they're viewed as foreign traders, they aren't allowed to join the military, aren't allowed to become a government employee, aren't allowed to own land. So basically they're left with no option but to rent a piece of land, open up a store, become a foreign investor. And then come the 1966, which post-mass killing, post the genocide, that there is a complete ban on their culture, but at the same time a lot of tycoons were slowly developing through difficult circumstances, are getting a lot of money, are seeing, and the political leader constantly attacking the Chinese. And then comes the 1998 riot attack again, physical attack from ordinary citizens on the Chinese public. So, 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 so there is a question of identity. After centuries of struggles of trying to find a place in this island, which is frankly their only home. They have no other home to go to. They're not immigrants who left impoverishing Europe, come to the shore of New York and started a new life in New York. That their home back in Europe is still kind of intact. They're different in the sense that their home back where they came from is no longer the same. China, for the past 5 centuries, would undergo multiple very different administration. There has been multiple wars, change of power from divided up by warlords from dynasty to warlords to empires to Japanese occupation to a democratic government to a communist government. So their home is not the home where they left. And for a lot of them, they're born here in Indonesia. So that their identity sometimes is a question that they ask. That they ask the question that whether there is a debate over who is pure-blooded ethnic Chinese, meaning that you did not marry with non-ethnic Chinese. And then you also got people who intermarried, who have a kind of an even weirder identity of who they are. And also by country. Some people felt very strongly as Indonesians even after all these years of segregation and assimilation. Whereas some felt like even though they're Indonesian citizens, they felt more lean towards China, even though they know nothing and have no right to live in China, but it's still more aligned with the identity with China. And there's also people who align their identity with the world. They feel like they're just like a world citizen. And then there is also by life goals. Some people felt like I'm just here to make a living. As again, we examine by Confucian concept that for some people it is okay to not have identity. Some people just felt like I'm just opening up a store. I just want to make some money, be happy with, buy some stuff, and that's their identity. So there is a mixture of a lot of different identity happening at the same time. So today the ban is gone, the community is back, but the perception, as we have seen in the national survey, is still has not changed much. And when one scholar wrote that many Pribumi, which means native Indonesians, still have a deep sense of distrust towards China in general because of the 1965 coup that is still believed is backed by China. And the current president Joko once was accused of being a Chinese, and his presidential team wrote an immediate response claiming that he's not Chinese. The level of urgency that Joko's presidential team took to respond to that Chinese criticism, which obviously is very illegit by just the pure look of Joko, just notes that how deep this divide is. And also, there is, when Joko awarded the Jakarta high-speed rail project to China or Japan, there was a huge backlash from the public over if this is again going to come close to a 1965 communist coup. There's a lot of that talk that's going out at this exact moment, and along with Jakarta's mayor, who was elected as old mayor, who was elected as ethnic Chinese, and he was multiple time attacked just based on his ethnicity group and on no other grounds. So that's all about the history. But what about real people? It's easy to sit in a coffee shop and read papers and feel like you have a good grasp on the lives of this group of people who have been here for centuries. But in reality, just reading in the coffee shop is cool. It's amazing. It's good to drink coffee and just good to read. But that's not the future of it all. So I was honored with, and thanks to Lufti who is here today, to visit some of the Chinese Indonesian communities whom we had no idea. For example, take example of this jewelry shop owner that we happened to bump into in the first day. We were just wandering off in Chinatown. We had no idea what we were doing. This was Lufti's friend, who he was born ethnic Chinese, but he doesn't really live in Georgia. But he took us to the Chinatown, and we just started wandering around, and then we bumped, and through some just strange conversations, we end up getting directed to this jewelry shop where we met this lovely couple who for 50 years have just been owning this jewelry shop. That's kind of have been their life. They spent 50 years. They've been owning this shop since 1950, and that's kind of their business, and that's kind of their life. Very lovely couple, very kind, quiet, not doesn't talk much, but when you ask, they always say, "Oh, life is not too difficult. It's okay. It's all right. It's not too bad for us." And then just the level of generosity from them is overwhelming. We just randomly walked into their store, and then we started talking, and then all of a sudden they were like, "We have a community of that we gather on the weekend. Here, let me introduce you to the head of our community." And he started calling people, texting people, and telling me that, "Oh, this is we have the Bahasa Order Perhimpunan, like a community of people from a certain region of China, and in fact, all of them are born here in Georgia, but they still speaks a little bit Mandarin, and just the level of friendliness and generosity from them was just amazing. And then through them, they connected us to the head of their clan, who his name is Jimmy. His family came to Indonesia in 1925 from Fujian region. They bought a passport through Hong Kong, which back then it was legal, and you still can do it. They bought a passport, came to Indonesia, and they rented out a business license with multiple other Chinese immigrants, and they shared licenses until they saved up enough money to open up their own business. And he graduated high school in 1964, right before the ban on Chinese language. He actually started working as a Chinese school teacher, and then because of the ban, he wasn't allowed to work as a teacher anymore. So he turned and became a businessman. And I think what really surprised me most through our extensive conversation is that he once said, I don't really want to become a businessman. I don't really want to just do business, but I was a teacher that was not allowed to teach. I was not allowed to become a government employee. I was not allowed to own land. I cannot join the military. I just cannot. And I have to feed my family in one way or another, and opening up a business was the only option he had. So in a sense that he felt like but when I asked him about if he felt his life was painful or difficult despite all the difficulties, he never said a lot about, he said it's important to feel the difficulties, and he, despite all of that, did not sound harsh towards Indonesia or felt anything but he's an Indonesian. And by the way, he owns the Malioboro Mall, just in case you wonder what he does. He is the owner of the Malioboro Mall, which he never mentioned is throughout the whole time we were together in interview. And then this is kind of their clan that they gather. This is like the Perimbuna, which is a word for it. This is like a sign inside the place. It's a very secret compound near the um, near the Malaporo main street, but they do. They're like they gather on Sunday morning, and one Sunday morning I went, and it was they served lots of delicious food and was just very welcoming and just very curious to talk, even though most of them don't really speak a lot of Mandarin, but they tried their best to talk. And this is a picture of the gathering, as you can see. This is kind of the community, and us together with some people there. This is some pictures of their showing the past. I believe this is a minister of commerce that they took a picture with. Just a little bit of the past. This is kind of like some of their artwork collections. And by the way, upstairs they have a little karaoke section because remember, Chinese songs are banned from karaoke, so they have their own little karaoke on the second floor, very hidden. It only opens on Tuesday and Thursday night. And I went on Thursday night, and it was very creepy walking down this alley going to their little house. There was nobody, and there was no street lamps. And then at the door, there was like a guy that was just like secretly standing there, and the door opening was like this wide, and it was, and it was very secretive. Even though it's like not illegal, but because of just years of discrimination, they still do it in secret. And he started questioning, why are you here? And I was like, oh, I had to explain to him, and he was like, oh yeah, go ahead. And then you went inside. The first floor is completely empty, but you can hear the music a little bit. It's upstairs. This is quite a scene of people in their 50s and 60s shouting out pop Mandarin songs. Quite a scenery, and most of them do not speak any Mandarin or English. They only speak Bahasa, but they still want to sing a little bit of Chinese songs. So you can see here there is the word for the karaoke, and on top of it, that's the pronunciation, because this is not a language they were allowed to learn, but they still want you to sing the song in Mandarin, so they have pronunciation on top of karaoke. Basically, just trying to learn how to pronounce the word as they sing. And some of them tell me that because of the ban till this day, that most of them buys their music from Malaysia. And just from the way they take care of their little CD of just horribly digitalized music, you can tell that they have a craving for this culture, but there's not a lot that they can get, and they really take great care of the CDs they have. And this is another person we met at the Burning Buna during the Sunday meeting. He was his name is Mr. Ling. He's a very friendly, yet another friendly businessman. He shared a similar past as Jimmy. His family came over, started a factory. Today he's the owner of, which mall does he own? Rami Mall, another mall. And he also has a factory of woodwork, and he employs over 1,000 employees. But despite all of that, he doesn't talk about any of this at all throughout our conversation. He's very humble and kind, and he even invited us right away to a funeral dinner of another local Chinese, and he was just, and we had no connection, and there's nothing that connects us. But he still was so kind and generous to answer all the questions I had over the community, and he is the one whom I asked the question, are you scared? Are you still scared till this day because of what happened in the past? And unfortunately, his answer is yes. He still feels that the government still could take away all of his business, everything. But he says, the only way he felt that he can do is to accumulate a little bit more wealth, so that they, like in Georgia, because of the combination of all the wealthy ethnic Chinese businessmen, despite the fact they're not to own land and have no representation in the Sultan's palace, that they have economic say. Because of the economic importance, they have a say over some of the policies. That's kind of a weird and wicked way they have developed, but that's just kind of their community. And here is Miss Chen, who is the other spectrum of. I met her one noon when I was visiting the youth center, who was offering free acupuncture. She was just finished with her acupuncture session, and then she spoke a little Mandarin, and we just sat down and talked for a long time about her life. And she, till this day, she's retired. She has a tiny house in Georgia. She's not wealthy. She's lived her life as a little merchant, and she just quietly lives her life. Not really, but she was very. She was married to the countryside, and then came back into the city. But she talked so much about compassion and love. Was something that she kept repeating, using her limited vocabulary. She kept saying to me that you have to be compassionate, you have to be kind, and it was just very sweet meeting her. And this is a little bit of the youth group whom I met through the connection of some of the earlier. This is showing some of the lion dance heads they have. This is the youth center. You can see them playing, learning to do drums, and in fact, now there's a lot of because of the opening up. There's a lot of Indonesians, natives, non-ethnic Chinese are actually involved in this youth group, learning about drums, Chinese dance, dragon dance, lion dance, and upstairs of this gym hidden little Confucian temple, which I believe during the time when it was not allowed to practice Confucian as a religion, that this is a secret temple they used. And inside the temple, this is a dragon head that appeared to be about 100 years old. That was their very first dragon head they used to perform this spiritual dragon dance during the Lunar New Year. And wrong picture. And then this is this last Sunday. I was called. This to your right, the two of them are the ambassador of the Chinese youth group in Georgia, and to the right, he is the ambassador of last year. All of them just. I did not know this was happening, but Lufty gave me a call. I think at 11, and she told me, you have to go. They're waiting for you. They've been preparing the whole morning, and apparently, I asked this guy in the middle, who is who does admin at this youth center / funeral home. I was like, one day we're just talking. I was like, I would love to meet some Chinese Indonesian youths, and I just said that like a gentle saying, but he took it into heart, and then he organized the whole panel of people to talk, and they've been preparing the whole Sunday morning. All of them were sitting there. They had someone who speak Mandarin, someone who speak English, which was very cool. Just all of them, and they took me out to lunch. Went to a very great meat place. Anyways, so that's the youth. Learning about them, they were very friendly. So this is a story of a community of very different people, from the store owner who have quietly owned their jewelry store for 50 years, to the tycoons who own Somalia Coral Mall, to the elderly grandma who just wants to go by with her life and settle and goes gently into the world. This is a community of lots of stories and inspirations despite all of their history. And I think this is a community that still, till this day, is trying to define its identity because of the past. But I think there is hope meeting these youths that they are more willing to see people from outside and to meet outsiders, and to hoping to stop this trend of stereotype. So I just want to end with this quote from that says, reasonable people may have different views, and I respect the diversity of opinion that this case may generate. I would hope that all of us recognize, however, that we are members of one community, and will continue to be so long after these cases, these trials in the rearview mirror. What kind of community we will be, however, will be determined by how we treat each other over the next few weeks. As I said in my inaugural address, we must be quick to understand and slow to judge. I will approach one another with mutual respect as consider all points of view, not just during the trial, but also beyond it. Every day on our campus provide countless opportunities to learn, both from the vast intellectual resources at our disposal and from those we encounter who make this community special. And we have and will continue to embrace and celebrate diversity in every possible dimension. This is from the president of Harvard University. He made a public statement. As you know, Harvard is facing lawsuit in court right now over their admission practices. So that being said, this is something that, I think this sentence goes to all communities abroad and here, that it's important to embrace different culture and how we treat each other in the time of crisis and questions will define a community. So I think after all, they are all one Indonesian. They believe in one community, and they want to be one community. And I believe that there will be a day when the stereotype, that number will shrink to the majority on the disagree side. And thank you so much for your time. And any questions, thoughts? No prayers. Sorry. No prayers. I'm gonna run a credit slide so we have it. There we go. Yeah.